I work part-time at a diner, but my tuition is pretty expensive, so I've had to take on a couple side gigs to stay afloat. About a year ago, I started babysitting for some of my family friends. It's an easy job, and I usually have time to catch up on my homework. Last month, I started having car problems, so I needed some extra money fast. My aunt told me that her coworker was in need of a babysitter, but the house was in Golden Valley, which is a pretty sketchy area outside the city. I normally wouldn't go to a place like Golden Valley, but I really needed the money, so I said yes. The house was on a dirt road in the middle of nowhere, and it wasn't even a house. It was a double-wide trailer behind a bunch of broken-down cars. I felt very unsafe. It was already nighttime when I arrived. I knocked on the door, and a young couple answered. They both smiled at me, but I could tell by their expressions that they weren't expecting me to be black. There aren't a lot of people of color in our city, and I doubt that there are any in Golden Valley. Besides, my aunt is white, and I guess they assumed I would be too. They nervously invited me inside and gave me a quick tour. Their baby, Benji, was already asleep in his room. All I had to do was check on him every 20 minutes. It seemed like an easy gig. Then, the wife stopped at the door to one of the other bedrooms. My heart sank. There was a large Confederate flag on the door. She looked at me sheepishly and told me to stay out of that room. "Why?" I asked, assuming that they had some racist crap inside. The husband explained, "My dad's in there. He's old and feeble, so we don't trust him with Benji. Just don't disturb him, okay?" "I definitely won't," I told them. I just hoped he stayed in there and didn't bother me. The couple looked at each other nervously, then wished me luck and left. I sat on their dusty sofa and studied for my next econ test. Every 20 minutes, I popped my head into Benji's room. He slept peacefully. Everything was going well, until I heard a loud noise outside the trailer, as if someone had dropped something big and heavy. There were voices, too. I know I should have ignored it, but the voices got louder, and I could hear one guy shout, "Hurry up! They'll be home soon!" Whatever was happening outside, it wasn't good. These people were paying me to protect their child, and I couldn't just ignore this. I got out my phone to call the police, but we were out in the mountains, and I couldn't get any reception. I looked for a landline, but they didn't have one. I had to go out there myself. I slowly opened the front door and peered out. I saw 3 men loading up tires and car parts onto the back of their truck. They were robbing the place. "Hey!" I shouted. "What are you doing?" The 3 men turned to look at me. If they got any closer, I'd slam the door shut and lock it. I didn't realize that a 4th man was right next to the door. He grabbed me by my hair and pulled me out of the trailer. He threw me to the ground and stood over me. He had a long pipe that he waved back and forth. "What are you doing here?" he shouted. I was too scared to speak. The other men gathered around me too. They were giggling. They started saying horrible things to me, things I won't repeat. The man with the pipe walked closer. He looked like he was ready to attack. And then I heard a loud bang. The man froze. He dropped the pipe. I saw red spreading across the sleeve of his shirt. Then he crumpled onto the ground, holding his arm and whimpering. An old man, at least 80, stood in the doorway, holding a shotgun. "Get off my property," he growled. The 3 men grabbed their fallen friend and pulled him into the back of the truck. Within seconds, they drove off. I slowly got to my feet. I held up both my arms. The old man looked at me. He held his gun to the side. "Who are you?" he asked. I was terrified. This Confederate psycho was going to kill me. I never should have come here. "I'm the babysitter," I whispered. The old man looked at me for a long moment. I gulped. I had no idea what he was going to do. Then he said, "Well, then come inside. I think I might have woken Benji." He put his gun into the holster on his belt and held the door open. Slowly, I lowered my arms. I walked back in, and the old man closed and locked the door behind me.
"Sorry about all that,"
He said.
"but if you ever hear trouble on my property, come and get me, okay?"
Then he poured me some iced tea while I rocked Benji back to sleep. This whole experience was not at all what I expected. And even though I knew the neighborhood was dangerous, I felt absolutely comfortable inside their trailer. I've babysat for them 3 more times since. When I was a kid during the summer holiday, I would go to work with my dad. He was a trucker and would often be gone for days at a time. I loved riding in the truck, as we were always higher up than everyone else, and I loved to people watch. You would see people singing at the top of their lungs, couples arguing, even people picking their nose and eating it. This one time my dad asked me if I wanted to go with him, and said we would be gone for 3 days, which was the longest journey I ever did. I jumped at the chance and went to pack my things. We set off on the road. The sun was shining, and I honestly didn't have a care in the world. Just me and my dad. On our first night, my dad decided to pull into a truck stop to rest up for the night. There was a diner, a gas station, and a small convenience store to grab supplies for the road. We pulled in, and the place was relatively empty. Sometimes we would struggle to park, but this place had more than enough space. We went and ate dinner and got supplies for the next day so we could hit the road as soon as day broke. My dad went to get a shower in the rest stop facilities. I decided to play on my Game Boy while he did. I was playing away when there was a knock at the truck door.
"Hey, are you Chloe?"
I'm not sure how this guy knew my name, and I was taught never to talk to strangers, so rather than confirming my name, I asked how I could help.
"Your dad asked me to come and get you. He slipped in the shower and thinks he's broken his ankle."
I looked at him, but how else would he know my name? I dropped my Game Boy and jumped out of the truck. As soon as my feet hit the floor, the man grabbed me and started to pull me around to the back of the truck. He put his hand over my mouth so that I couldn't scream, but I bit his finger, which caused him to move his hand enough for me to scream help. Another trucker heard my scream and shouted over to let me go as he started to run over. The man dropped me to the floor and ran over a small hill behind the truck. The trucker ran over and asked me if I was okay before chasing after the man. It was too late though. The man had a car parked on the other side of the hill, and by this time he was too far away for the trucker to see the license plate or get a detailed description of the car. The trucker who helped me took me into the diner where it was safe, and there was staff that could keep an eye on me while he went to find my dad. My dad came in a few minutes later and apologized for leaving me and gave me a hug. We reported the incident to the police, but there were no cameras in that part of the truck stop, and no one really got a good look at the man's face. I'd hate to think what would have happened if that trucker hadn't heard my cries for help. I'm pretty sure this man had every intention of dragging me to the car and taking me somewhere, but for what purpose, I will never know. My boyfriend Joey and I were having some relationship problems. We'd been together for 3 years, and things used to be great between us. But for the last few months, we'd been fighting constantly. Joey kept accusing me of cheating on him with my coworker Dan, which definitely wasn't true. It was getting so bad that I decided to finally break up with him. But right before I could, he invited me to a really nice restaurant and apologized. He promised to stop acting so jealous. He said that he wanted to make things up to me. Then he showed me the 2 plane tickets that he'd gotten to Puerto Vallarta as a surprise. I was shocked. Joey was treating me to a 5-day vacation in Mexico. Of course, I changed my mind about breaking up with him. I scheduled my days off from work, and 2 weeks later, we flew to Puerto Vallarta. Joey spared no expense. He got us this really beautiful Airbnb right on the beach. It had a jacuzzi, a huge bedroom, and a balcony overlooking the ocean. I tried to ask him how much he was spending on the place, but he just said that it was worth it. It was all for me. The first day there was amazing. We strolled along the boardwalk and tried some of the local food. When we walked by some shops, Joey asked me what souvenirs I liked, and he bought them for me instantly. I knew that he was really trying to make up for all those months of arguing. That night, we drank margaritas and watched the sunset from our balcony. The next day, we just hung out on the beach. Joey splashed around in the water while I read on the beach. He kept teasing me about not wanting to go into the ocean. It was a little annoying. Joey was always so competitive about everything, and back when we first started dating, I had mentioned that I'd been a champion swimmer back in high school. He was so proud of his own swimming abilities, so he kept challenging me to a race. Eventually, I just gave up and told him that I'd lied. I said that I actually couldn't swim. That shut him up for a while, but ever since then, whenever we were near water, he always teased me about it. Aside from his jokes, the day was relaxing and great. That night, we sang karaoke with the locals. The next day, Joey rented a boat and took me sailing off the coast. It was fun at first, but once we were far enough from shore, his whole personality changed. He started asking me about Dan again. He said that he knew I'd lied to him and that he had proof. I knew there was no proof because there was nothing between me and Dan, but he just wouldn't stop. We started yelling at each other. He even pushed me, which is something he'd never done before. I started to get a little scared, especially because we were so far away from anyone else. I begged him to stop, and he did. He got really quiet and then disappeared below deck. I thought he was just cooling off, but then he came back upstairs with a spear gun. He pointed it at me and demanded that I admit to cheating on him. I looked him right in the eyes and told him he was insane. He laughed and said, "Wrong answer." Then he pulled the trigger. The spear shot into my shoulder. I'd never felt such pain in my life. Everything went black, and the next thing I knew, I was floating in the water. I looked up, and the boat was speeding back to shore. Joey had left me to die. This whole trip to Mexico was part of some sick plan to kill me and get away with it. I struggled to stay afloat. The pain was overwhelming, and I almost gave up. I felt myself sinking. But my anger toward Joey kept me going. Even though it had been years since I was on the swim team, it all came back to me. I took it one stroke at a time, fighting through the pain. The coast was far in the distance, and my blood was probably attracting all sorts of sharks. But I kept swimming. It took me hours and hours. I was losing blood fast. Every movement was difficult. Then, just as the sun was setting, I finally made it back to shore. I stumbled onto the beach, exhausted, and walked back to the Airbnb. When I got there, I saw 2 police cars parked outside. Joey was inside with the cops, probably telling them that I'd fallen off the boat and drowned. You won't believe the look on his face when I walked in. My shoulder was still bloody and wounded. I had enough strength to tell the police what really happened, and then I passed out. I woke up in a nearby hospital. I was all bandaged up, and an IV was in my arm. My nurse told me that Joey had been taken to jail. She gave me directions to the place, but I told her not to bother. He could rot in there as far as I cared. I spent the rest of the trip by myself, enjoying the Airbnb and spending as much of Joey's money as I could. Then I flew back to America. I never saw Joey again. I've been working in retail for various outlets and large supermarket chains for over 20 years, and I have to say the single creepiest thing I've ever experienced during all that time was 1722. Now obviously I know most of you are thinking, 1720 what now? So let me explain. It wasn't a big thing, not an incident that would make the national news or even the local papers, but it was enough to freak me and everyone working at that store out enough that most of us quit within a month of it first happening. I won't mention the name of the supermarket chain I was working for at the time, other than to say that it's one of the big ones, and that a lot of its stores are now open 24 hours a day. It was during one of these evening shifts that the 1722 thing happened. When the 24-hour opening was first introduced, the number of people visiting our town was quite high. Shift workers, people with kids, or those who were just generally night owls would come in and lazily push around their trolleys at 3 a.m. while the majority of the staff working were busy restocking shelves for the far busier day shifts. With less customers, things changed. As the months went on, the number of nighttime visitors began to dwindle, and the place took on that oddly menacing quality you get in places that are usually full of life, but are now not. The company saved money by only half lighting the place. Suddenly, the shadows were longer, and the light took on an eerie, flickering yellow tone that always made me think of hospitals and sick people. The reduced light meant that the few customers who did turn up walked even more slowly, in a sort of half-shuffling daze, and for whatever reason as the months went on, the staff became more and more hushed. Whereas at the start, you would have really found little difference between the day and night in the store, except perhaps for the fact that there were less people. Over time, the place became quiet and muted at night, as if the staff subconsciously knew that they should whisper so as not to wake people who were not there. It was in the midst of a hush like this, while I was sitting, half dozing at one of the registers, waiting for the few customers to approach and ring up their items, that the tannoy suddenly crackled into life. Used almost every few minutes during the day, it was very rare for the tannoy, the internal broadcast system for the store, to be operated at night. Usually when it did burst into life, it was to say something stupid like, "Tom to the cashier's desk," or "Clean up on aisle 2. This night, though, it said only one thing.
1722.
Then it went dead again. The moment lasted less than 5 seconds, but it was enough to make everyone in the place, staff and customers alike, stop dead and look at one another. Unlike in the daytime when the voices over the tannoy were disingenuously bright and cheery, especially when addressing customers to remind them of offers, this voice was, well, in a word, awful. It seemed somehow disembodied, as if it were speaking through a mouth not attached to the rest of the body. The voice was male, and had a rough, gravelly quality to it that made it sound like it was being forced or dragged out of the speaker in some way. It was a hoarse, almost whisper, and quite frankly, it made no sense. After a few minutes of chatter amongst staff members, work resumed as normal. An hour later, though, the same thing happened. The same voice over the tannoy, the same rasping, strangulated sound, and the same message.
1722.
This continued for a week. At first, we all thought it was a prank. One of the younger employees risking a disciplinary note in his file by using the tannoy inappropriately and winding up the rest of his colleagues. What freaked us all out, however, was when our manager, Arnold, told us that the CCTV showed the tannoy going off by itself. Nobody was close to it. No one in the immediate vicinity. It was malfunctioning somehow and broadcasting this message.
1722.
On the 7th night that this weird message was played, the frequency was upped. Instead of every hour, the voice came every half hour, and then every 15 minutes. It's hard to explain to someone who wasn't in the place at the time, but there was something distinctly menacing about that voice. Something that sounded hostile or aggressive, as if the person were spitting the numbers at us as a rebuke or perhaps as a warning. The following day, in the afternoon shift, 60% of the staff called in sick. Not because there had been some kind of spooky disease outbreak linked to the voice, but because, as most of them admitted later, they were scared that the voice was a warning. They didn't want to be in the place at 1722 in the afternoon.
What if it's a warning?
One colleague asked.
What if there's going to be an active shooter at that time? An earthquake or some kind of gas explosion that goes off at exactly 22 minutes past 5?
Over the next month, staffing for the afternoon shifts became harder and harder. People are superstitious by nature, and even if they were not to start with, hearing that voice would soon make you believe. Eventually, the issue got so bad that the company had to start offering double time for afternoon shifts, a step we all refer to as danger money. Of course, there were others with even more outlandish explanations. Old Jack, a guy I worked with on the night shift, was convinced that the voice was that of Jim Lemon, a local murderer who had been executed by hanging around a quarter mile from where the store now stood in, you guessed it, 1722. A few of the more scientifically minded folks tried to explain the incidents away,
saying that it was probably the communication system picking up radio waves and signals from another nearby radio broadcasting on a similar bandwidth, or something like that. Why that other broadcast would simply be repeating the same numbers over and over, they never quite explained. About a month after the voice began to be heard at night, it suddenly stopped. We went a full shift without a single word being broadcast over the tannoy. We did, however, hear a few days later that our manager, a guy named Arnold, had quit, completely out of the blue. There were 2 rumors about this. I'm not sure if I believe either, but I'll tell you them anyway. The first was that while we hadn't heard the voice on that particular night, Arnold had, in his own bedroom. He had been sleeping soundly in his room at home, when, according to the gossip at work, he had been awoken by a voice speaking from behind the curtain at the end of his bed. The same voice that leaked out over the tannoy, giving the same 4-number message. The second rumor, and this one I'm really unsure about, was that in his youth, Arnold served 4 years in prison. This much of the story I believe, because Arnold actually mentioned it to me once or twice. What I find hard to believe, but which I have not been brave enough to check, is that not only did Arnold's cellmate die under mysterious circumstances, but the prisoner number of this deceased cellmate was 1722. You can believe what you like, but the whole thing was enough to freak me out and make me decide to work the day shift from that point on, making sure in the process that I was finished, clocked out, and on my way home by the time 5:20 rolled around.
I don't think anyone grows up wanting to be a trucker. When adults asked in school, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" I always said, a ballerina. What no one tells you when you're young and full of dreams is that those dreams aren't free. In fact, college is so expensive, I feel like you should be able to sue. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, just for the chance to be great? With how much it costs, college degrees should come with the guarantee of a kick-ass career when you finish. Anyway, my college grant started running out. I took a year off to save money to finish off my career to pursue those dreams in dance. Luckily for me, my father worked as a trucker and got me a job working for the company he worked for without much issue. And I'm not gonna lie, at first, the job totally sucked ass. I'm a 5'4" woman who, although wasn't skinny or small, looked sweet and innocent. Getting people to take me seriously when we first met was always a losing fight. But trying to get a bunch of burly men who have driven trucks for decades to take me seriously? Damn near impossible. But I had a smart mouth and a take-no-shit attitude that eventually made the other guys lay off me for the most part. It wasn't my dream job, but it paid well, and most importantly, it was a solitary job where the only person I had to depend on most of the time was myself. In a way, I enjoyed what I did. Well, that was until one night about a year into me working as a trucker. I was traveling with a truckload of soft drinks for a fairly short drive, which was still about a 3-hour trip. When I got to the gas station, I made quick work with the manager on site, getting the product into the store and making sure the necessary paperwork was accounted for before I headed for the restroom. When you're stuck on the road for hours at a time, especially when you're a woman with a small bladder, you take advantage of every restroom you come across. I was exiting the restroom stall when I saw a woman at the sink, crying softly as she touched her face. I was confused, and I'll be completely honest, I didn't want to talk to her at all because I didn't do well with tears and heavy emotions. Probably due to the fact I grew up with a dad who drilled into me that crying didn't solve anything, so might as well not even do it. Still, I ended up asking her, awkwardly, if she was okay. It was as if she was waiting for someone to ask her, because before I knew it, she went into detail about how her boyfriend had hit her and stranded her in the gas station, and she didn't have any money or anyone to call to help her get home. Again, I did not want to get involved, but I couldn't let another woman be stuck in the middle of nowhere, late at night where anything could happen. I offered her a ride in my truck, since I was technically headed in the same direction she needed to go in. All the way to her house, the girl talked about her life, her dogs, her hobbies, and anything else that popped into her head. I'm not much of a chatter, but I nodded my head and gave her small answers to make her feel at ease as she rambled on. When we got to her address, I remember instantly being on alert. The neighborhood she lived in was quiet,
and all the streetlights were either off or looked to be broken. And when we pulled in front of her house, it looked like it had been abandoned for years. I turned to ask the girl if she was sure this was the right address, when I felt something cold and metal hit my head.
"Get out of the truck and give us all your money," said the girl, who had been bubbly and cheerful just a moment before, and now with no humor or sweetness in her tone. That's when I looked out of the truck and saw a guy who also had a gun pointed at me. I had been played. I gave up my wallet to the girl and my phone, but was fortunate that I didn't have all my credit cards in my wallet. But they took my necklace that had belonged to my mother before she died when I was a kid. When they took everything that was of value from me, they jumped into a car that was parked in front of the abandoned house and sped off. I wish I could say that I caught a glimpse of a license plate or called the police, but I was in too much shock, and honestly, I blame myself. I knew better than to get involved, and I still drove this girl, who I didn't know, into a trap. I thought that since she was a petite, innocent-looking girl, she wasn't a threat to me. I made the same assumption that everyone made when they looked at me. I did end up filing a police report when my father found out what happened, but I never got my mother's necklace back. All I know is if I ever see this girl again, I won't hesitate to mess her up for stealing something so precious to me. And if the girl's listening, I just want to say, fuck you. I hope you get what's coming to you.
Sleep paralysis isn't something new to me. I've suffered from this condition since I was a teenager, probably due to my home life and PTSD growing up. But this story isn't about my childhood trauma, thankfully. If you don't know what sleep paralysis is, it's basically when you wake up suddenly from REM, and although your brain is technically awake, your body is unfortunately still in REM mode, and you cannot move, which can cause the feeling of being paralyzed in your own body, aware but unable to do anything about it. People with this condition often see things. Hallucinations are what I mean. Some might be mild, but others might be your worst nightmare come to life. I had one of those nightmares a week ago. It started similarly to every previous experience. I woke up to being paralyzed in my bed, and like I mentioned before, since I'm so used to sleep paralysis, I didn't panic at first and tried to stay calm. I let my body fully relax for what felt like a few minutes before I tried getting up. Surprise, surprise, I couldn't. I tried a couple more times, and the panic that wasn't there before started to build up in my chest. I knew that if I couldn't move within a certain amount of time, the hallucinations would start. But awareness didn't do anything to stop them from manifesting. When I was able to get up, I cried with relief and ran to my bedroom door to try to get out of the darkness of my room. But when I opened the door, I found myself looking back up at my bedroom ceiling. The fan was turning fast, and I felt dread deep in my heart. I struggled in my body, screaming to my sisters, who were my roommates, to help. But of course, no words came out, and I was completely stuck in my body. After enough struggle, I got off my bed and ran, again, for my bedroom door. I managed to scream this time for my family, and I felt the carpet beneath me as I ran, and I felt the cold metal of the doorknob as I turned it. I knew that I was awake this time. I was close to safety. I opened the door, and when I looked up, I was back to looking up at the ceiling in my bed again. The cycle repeated, over and over, until I felt like I'd be trapped forever. I felt myself stop trying, feeling utterly defeated and alone. After what felt like hours, but must have been minutes, passed, I felt my joints relax. But still, my mind was untrusting. I tested my fingers first, moving one at a time, and then wiggled my toes. When those movements felt real, I tried sitting up. My bed made a sound, and I felt my blanket fall off me. I stood on shaking legs as I eyed the door, scared to make any sudden move. I found the courage to stand up and took a deep breath. I was scared, so I thought running to the door would help get the nerves out. I counted to 3 and ran. My hand touched the doorknob, and I knew it felt real before, but this time, it really did feel real. Before I could turn the knob, a cold, bony hand grabbed my neck from behind and started to squeeze. I tried to scream, but whatever held me cut off my windpipe, so only a wheeze sounded out. The creature brought me close to its chest. its body so cold, slimy, and almost skeletal, like a walking corpse. It whispered something in my ear that I still can't get out of my head a week later.
You belong to me. There will never be an escape.
It then laughed wickedly until I was suddenly lying in the bed again, in tears, and finally fully awake. I ran out the door and wanted to wake my sisters up, but it was 3 a.m. I stayed up the rest of the early morning until the sun came out, and even then I was shaking as I tried to get a couple more hours of sleep. I'm terrified to sleep again. I'm scared to see whatever the hell it was, and I'm scared it was right. That one day I wouldn't be able to escape when I got sleep paralysis again. That one day I will truly belong to it. I worked at Target during college to help pay for school. The pay wasn't fantastic, but I loved working there with the other people. Eventually, I got promoted to manager. However, because of this experience, I didn't last long in that role. About 6 months into my new managerial role, I agreed to take on a shift for a colleague who was sick with the flu. It was a weekday, and into the evening, it eventually began to clear out and die down. This led to a nice lull, and we were able to get things done ahead of closing. I went to the office to begin the mountains of paperwork needed to close out, but kept my walkie on in case someone needed me. About an hour into this, I got an alert on my walkie that I was needed in the checkout area to deal with an escalating situation. Justin, one of my former coworkers, was checking out a woman when he accidentally double rang an item, and the woman was accusing him of trying to take money from her. I got up and headed out of the office, going into the lion's den. I'll give some perspective into how loud this woman was screaming. The manager's office was on one side of the super target, close to the electronics. Justin was assigned to a register on the other side of the store, right by the grocery department. I could make out every word that Karen was screaming as soon as I stepped out. I knew right away this wouldn't be an easy fix. I radioed another manager, Roger, for backup, alerting him that he might have to call the on-duty officer. Putting on my best customer service face, I headed over. Poor Justin looked about ready to pass out as I approached. Our Karen saw me and like a laser turned her focus on me.
I want you to fire him right now. I'm not going to leave until you fire him.
I could tell it was going to be one of those days. This woman, like Cersei Lannister in Game of Thrones, was out for blood and wasn't going to stop until she got it.
It's an easy fix, ma'am. I can take the extra item off the register for you. Just give me a couple minutes. You're not going to feed me that bullshit now, are you?
Karen snapped like a rabid dog.
I know you types. No, seriously, ma'am. It'll just take a couple minutes for me to fix,
I said, nodding at Roger to call the on-duty officer.
You know what? Screw this. You just lost a loyal customer. I hope this store burns to the ground.
Karen shrieked, picking up a can of tomatoes from her cart and hurled them at us. Fortunately, she missed by a wide margin, and it cracked the register screen open. She stormed out while the three of us just stared at each other, unbelieving what we had just seen. I gave Justin a break so he could compose himself and cleared the items, preparing to take them back. We continued the rest of the day, and by the time we locked down the store, I had forgotten the Karen's outburst. Roger and I were halfway across the parking lot when someone in the parking lot turned on their brights. We were blinded when all of a sudden we heard a revving engine. Roger and I ran back to the store, getting behind the great red barriers that blocked the front of the store from traffic. There was a terrific crash as someone rammed their car into the barriers. We called for emergency services from inside the store. When the cops arrived, they found Karen passed out on the inside of the car, and she was taken to the hospital. It was a mess. I don't know if charges were ever pressed against Karen or not, because the police never got back to us. I was so rattled by what happened that I quit Target shortly afterwards and took a management job in another city. This happened several years ago, and I'm shaking as I type this up on the keyboard. There truly are crazy people out there in the world. As a truck driver, I have always had a sense of dislike towards my job. I spent days, even weeks sometimes, away from my wife and son. I've been a truck driver for over 10 years, and there have been several strange events that I've encountered on the roads at night. However, one particular incident stands out in my mind.
It was a usual Monday night when I was heading towards Boston in my truck. It was 2 a.m, and as I drove down the highway, I suddenly got the urge to go to the toilet. I had passed a gas station not too long back, so I knew the next one wouldn't be for a good while. The only option I had was to stop at the side of the road near some trees and bushes, get it done with, and resume my journey as quickly as possible. There are several risks involved in stopping in the middle of nowhere, including getting caught by the police, being attacked, or even robbed at gunpoint. I had never had any of these encounters before, so I decided to take the risk and stop at any suitable place I could pull in. Luckily, I found somewhere not too far down the road. I pulled in and jumped out of the truck and ran over to the nearest tree. That's when I heard a cell phone ringing further into the trees, about 20 feet in front of me.
Hello?
I looked around and couldn't see anyone. It was well lit at the side of the road, but looking into the trees was like staring into the depths of the ocean at night. I ran back to the truck, jumped inside and locked the doors. I used the flashlight from inside my truck to see if I could see anyone, but there was no one there. I could still hear the phone ringing, and then I realized the ringtone was the same as mine, and I couldn't find my phone. There was no way my phone ended up all the way out there without the intervention of someone or something else. I decided stupidly to go towards the ringing and see if it was my phone. As I was walking through the trees and getting closer to where the ringing sound was coming from, I saw the shadow of a man standing in the trees. I couldn't see his face, but I could see his large white eyes. I spent no time at all turning around and running back to my truck. No way was I going to go any further after seeing a man conveniently out in the woods where I decided to stop. I didn't get to the phone, but I wasn't sticking around any longer. I put my foot down and set off driving. A few miles down the road, I saw what I assumed was a hitchhiker standing by the side of the road, but this guy didn't have his thumb out. I started to slow down, but as I got closer, I noticed the man resembled the shadowy figure I'd seen in the trees. Same wide eyes, and again, no facial features. I'm not saying he didn't have any, more that he was likely to be wearing something to cover his face, like a mask or bandana or something. I put my foot down, and as I passed him, my phone started ringing from under my seat. I leaned forward to look and feel where my phone was when I saw the same man standing in the middle of the road. I naturally swerved and jackknifed the truck, crashing it into some trees. I hit my head on the steering wheel and was thrown around the cab as I lost control. In my panic, I'd forgotten to put on my seatbelt. I was accused of falling asleep at the wheel and fired from my job as a truck driver. No one believed I swerved to avoid a man in the middle of the road. I really don't believe I imagined it, but I just don't understand what it could have been. I used to go out with this boy in high school, who I'll refer to as Josh for the purpose of this story. We had been dating on and off for years. He was funny and cute, but a little misunderstood, as cliche as that sounds. It was Valentine's Day, and I was 16 at the time. Josh said he had a surprise for me that evening and to dress up nice as he was taking me out.
Be ready at 5. I'll pick you up from your house.
This was very unlike Josh. You see, Josh was generally quite quiet and not very assertive. A lot of people, even my friends, didn't really like him and thought he was weird. I thought he could act a little strange at times, but we'd known each other since we were kids, and I knew he was harmless. After school had finished, I took the bus home and started to get ready for my date with Josh. I was excited as to where we could be going. At exactly 5 o'clock, there was a knock at my door. I ran downstairs to see Josh standing there in a full suit with a tie and everything. He was holding the biggest bunch of flowers I'd ever seen.
You look beautiful. These are for you.
Josh handed me the flowers. I passed them to my mom, who was standing about 10 feet from the door, with that excited look moms have when their child goes out on their first real date. To be honest, I was surprised she didn't have her camera out and taking pictures. Josh didn't drive, so his dad was chauffeuring us to a surprise location. We arrived at this nice little Italian restaurant, which was well known by locals. It was set at the bottom of these beautiful, picturesque gardens, which was separated by a river. It was near impossible to get a table at this restaurant on Valentine's Day, but it turned out that Josh's dad knew the owner through his work and was able to squeeze us in. We had this cute little table in the corner of the room. It had a rose and a card with my name written on it when we arrived. He must have dropped it off prior to picking me up. Josh said he didn't want me to open the card until after the meal. It was perfect and so thoughtful. We ate our food and had some laughs, chatting about growing up and how much people had changed over the years. By 7 o'clock, we'd finished our meal and dessert, and Josh suggested we go for a walk. My dad isn't picking us up until 8. Did you want to go for a walk outside into the gardens? The sun had just about set, but you could still see the red glow in the sky. We left the restaurant and walked towards the gardens. There was a bridge, which overlooked a river you had to cross to get into the gardens. As we reached the bridge and watched the water rushing below, Josh spoke. You, can open your card now. I opened the card, and it read, Dear Jody, I have always loved you. I want to spend eternity with you. Please take my hand and follow me. Josh looked at me and held out his hand. I resisted for a second, but was curious to see where this led. I took Josh's hand, thinking he was going to lean in and kiss me, when he started to climb onto the railing of the bridge. I pulled back, but Josh held tightly onto my hand. What are you doing? Making sure we stay together forever. Josh was a lot stronger than I realized and was pulling me closer to the rail. As he climbed down onto the other side, he asked me, Don't you want to jump with me? Josh said this with so much sincerity, I thought he might have been joking up until this point. I screamed and pulled back, and thankfully there was a man and his wife coming onto the bridge. It's hard to remember exactly what happened, but I remember the man grabbing Josh, pulling him back over the railing. The police were called, and Josh was taken away. His mom and dad later found a suicide note in his room, saying we wanted to be together forever. I can't help but wonder if he had jumped while holding on to me, would he have pulled me over with him? I'm thankful for the man that saved my life that day, but I never got a chance to tell him. I never saw Josh again after that. I'm not sure I would want to. It was both the best and yet the worst night of my life. When I was still in high school, I used to play World of Warcraft. I'm a female, and it's not a game you'd expect a girl to typically be interested in, but I was a bit of an outlier. Now, I didn't know anyone who would play the game with me in real life. My friends at school didn't want to get a subscription, and they didn't have time, which meant that I had to find a raid group online. I found a raid group by meeting a player named Tobson. I played a healer role, and they needed healers, so I was accepted quite easily. It was a small group, not enough for a raid yet, but enough to do other quests. Without getting too much into the details of the game itself, most of the players when I played with them were nice and kind to me. Now, I can't recall exactly the gender of each group member, but I'm pretty sure most were guys. Perhaps that's one of the reasons why I stood out, since they knew I was a girl. This wasn't a problem. I was just happy to play with them, and besides, from the light teasing, they treated me the same. Tobson, however, was different. He was very affectionate to me, and often gave me gold and in-game items to me via mail, because according to him, I was doing such a good job as a healer. I was young at the time, so I had mixed feelings about it, but I assumed the best intentions in him. However, one day, I was casually talking with the group, including Tobson. We discussed what state we lived in. Coincidentally, Tobson lived just a state over from me, but he used to live in my state before moving to where he was. I suppose I developed a sense of trust in Tobson, since he seemed friendly and he lived in my state, so for some reason, I rationalized a sense of trust for him. He asked me where I lived, saying he wanted to know if we used to live nearby. I gave him my general area, but not a specific address. He then asked me if I had any social media, like Facebook or Twitter. I told him I didn't really want to share that with him, and he didn't seem to push further, so I thought nothing much of it. One day, I think it was a few days before Valentine's Day, Tobson confessed to me in a private message, saying he developed feelings for me. Now, I didn't know this guy. I didn't know how old he was. I didn't see him that way, so I politely rejected him in private conversation. Despite my rejection, Thompson was still trying to get close to me by giving me gold and items as he did before. With the context of the confession, I felt like he was intruding on my personal space, and I told him to stop. Despite me telling him to stop, he didn't, so I just left the group and blocked him from my friends list. A few days later, I had a message on my Facebook from a guy named Toby Gibson asking me if I was okay. I knew this was Thompson, but I don't know how he found my Facebook despite me not giving it to him. However, I suspect he found it since I used my first name as a username. I didn't expect he could find me with that info alone, but I realized he also knew my state and general area, so it was most likely he was searching for me with this specific information. I blocked him and didn't bother with him much. I was creeped out a lot, but I tried to keep my cool. I took a break from the game and the online world for a while, and nothing really happened for a good few weeks. That is, until one day during the middle of the night, I saw a van sitting outside my house. I had never seen the van before, but it looked like there was someone sitting inside. Eventually, I saw a man get out and walk over to one of my neighbor's house and knock on the door. I saw him knock on 2 of my neighbor's doors, but no one answered, but the third one did. I don't know what they were discussing, but I noticed my neighbor glance up at my house, and then the man turned around to look in my direction. Shortly after this, my house phone rang and my dad picked it up. Turns out, the guy in the van was looking for someone with my name. Immediately, I had a suspicion on who he was. I told my dad to call the cops as I genuinely felt threatened by this guy. My dad wasn't happy, but he did as I said. But after that, Thompson came up to my door. I hid from sight and asked my dad to tell him to go away. He answered the door for me, and my dad said there was no one by my name in this house. After a while, I heard the door close and he went away. He didn't say much, but according to my dad, he had a bunch of flowers in his hand. My dad wanted to rip his head off, as the man looked to be about 40 years old, but he knew the police would be here soon. The cops eventually came, and Thompson was questioned for his suspicious actions, especially with me being underage. He was apprehended, but he told the police that he didn't know I was underage. He just said he knew me from gaming and wanted to bring me flowers and ask me out on a date. I don't know what happened to Thompson after that. I never heard from him again, and the friends from my World of Warcraft group say they haven't seen him online since. Creepy thing is, I told Thompson I was only 14, and he still pursued to track me down.
So this is a real crazy story that happened to me a while back. I'm no writer or anything, but I thought I'd share this because it still freaks me out to this day. It was a dark, moonless night, and I was driving down this long, desolate road in the middle of nowhere. I'm talking pitch black all around, and the only light came from my car's headlights. Yeah, that kind of eerie setting. I was about halfway through this seemingly endless stretch of road when I saw him. A guy, standing there on the side of the road. Looked like he'd been walking for miles. Now, I'm not the kind to normally pick up hitchhikers, but something about this guy just seemed off, like he really needed help. So I pulled over and rolled down the window. He walked up to me, and man, he looked messed up. He had dirty clothes, wild hair, and his eyes, they had this strange, distant look, like he'd seen things that scarred him for life. But hey, I thought I was doing a good deed. "Need a ride, buddy?" I asked, trying to sound friendly. He nodded and muttered a quick, "Thanks," and hopped into the passenger seat. As he got in, I caught a whiff of this awful stench, like something had crawled inside him and died. But I figured he'd been walking for hours, so I didn't say anything. We drove in silence for a while. The only sound was the hum of the engine. It was starting to get to me, so I decided to break the ice. "So, where are you headed?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He turned to me, and I swear his eyes had this creepy glint to them.
"Just keep driving,"
he said, his voice low and hoarse. It made me feel uneasy, but I thought maybe he was just tired or something. So I kept driving. But as time went on, things started getting weirder. He started muttering under his breath, like he was talking to himself. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but it sounded like some kind of prayer or curse or something. Then he started fidgeting in his seat, his hands twitching. I asked him if he was okay, and he snapped at me, "Just drive!" His voice had this menacing edge to it. I didn't know what to do. I was in the middle of nowhere with this crazy guy in my car, but I kept driving, hoping to reach the next town soon. That's when things took a really dark turn. Out of nowhere, he lunged at me, his hands wrapped around my throat. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I swerved the car, trying to shake him off, but he was like a madman possessed. He kept squeezing, and I thought I was a goner. But then, by some miracle, I managed to slam on the brakes, and the sudden stop sent him flying forward. He hit the windshield with a sickening thud and fell back, clutching his head in pain. I didn't waste a second. I threw open the door and bolted out of the car, gasping for air. I looked back, and the guy was crawling over the seat towards me, his eyes filled with this unholy rage. I couldn't believe it. I didn't stick around to find out what he was going to do next. I sprinted into the trees, and eventually I came to a road where I saw the distant glow of a gas station. I ran inside, my heart pounding, and called the cops. They arrived pretty quickly, and I told them everything. But when we went back to the car, the guy was gone, vanished without a trace. They searched the area, but there was no sign of him anywhere. I had to get some medical attention for the bruises on my neck, and the cops took my statement. They never found the guy, and I don't know what the heck was wrong with him, but I'll never forget those cold, empty eyes. That night has made me swear off picking up hitchhikers for good, no matter how much they look like they need help. Trust your instincts out there, and stay safe on those dark, lonely roads. You never know who or what you might come across. After dealing with several issues, including a brief period of homelessness, I finally got my first house. It wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, a bath and a half, a small yard. It wasn't much, but it was perfect for myself and my cat, Boots. We had survived the worst areas of our city, so we made sure to go into the old suburbs, full of nice families and safety. It was a wonderful change of pace from my previous life, of not knowing where I was going to sleep that night, or where my next meal was going to come from. At least, we thought it was at first. When we moved in, my next-door neighbors arrived with a plate of cookies and warm welcomes. It was a family of 4, Mom, Barb, Dad, Frank, and 2 kids, Alice and Kevin. The kids in particular warmed to Boots and spent hours playing with him. At least once a week, the family would stop by and say hello. It wasn't long before I was babysitting Alice and Kevin, and we were having cookouts/family board games nights. As I'm not on the best terms with my family, it was really nice to have that sense of belonging somewhere. At least, it was nice at first. As the months passed, I realized that Frank was acting a bit more inappropriate. It didn't start out that way, but his touches and glances became longer. Each hug and touch became longing. I didn't say anything to anyone, though, because I wanted to believe I was imagining it. And I didn't really become uncomfortable around any of them. Maybe it was me wanting to believe that I was in a safe place now, without much to worry about. I'm not really sure anymore. As the months passed, Barb, Alice, and Kevin didn't visit me as much, and Frank visited me more and more without his family around. He also began opening up to me more and more about the state of his marriage and family life. How Barb was a nagging housewife who never gave him any peace. Alice was getting interested in stuff like boys and social media, and Kevin hanging out with a gang of what he called troublemakers. I sympathized and offered a listening ear because that's what I thought he was really after. I didn't have a confidant or anything like that during my rough time, and would never wish that on my worst enemy. So I thought I was doing him a favor. I didn't idealize the family at all, but it surprised me that Frank was having all of these troubles, especially considering he carried himself with a cheerful, positive demeanor. Then Barb started changing as well. It started with her making passive-aggressive comments and having an edge of sarcasm. You know Mother Gothel from Tangled? It was like that. She'd make comments about things, about me, ranging from my appearance all the way to how I was taking care of Boots, and then laugh and say I shouldn't take her so seriously because she was just joking. At first, the comments hurt the same way that a stinging fly's bite does, but as time went on, it became more and more painful. It got to the point that I started avoiding the family as much as possible. Why didn't I get out of there, you ask? I had sunk the entirety of my life savings into this place, and I didn't have to worry about where my next bite to eat was going to come from, or if I'd have a roof over my head that night. I had sacrificed so much and worked so hard to get where I was, and swore Boots and I would never go back. My friend called it the sunk cost fallacy. In hindsight, I should have listened to my gut and gotten the hell out of there. It took a creepy experience before I finally realized that I needed to get out of there with Boots, and fast. One night, I turned in as soon as I got home because I'd worked late at my job and wanted to get some chores done the next day as it was my day off. I hadn't been asleep for very long when I heard Boots hissing. Half awake, I turned on the lights to see what he was hissing at and about jumped out of my skin. There, standing in my bedroom, was Frank. I screamed, grabbed Boots, and got out of the house. I ran as fast and as far as I could before flashing red and blue lights caused me to stop. The police officer was kind and called for other officers to investigate the house. Frank was long gone. He had gotten in by slashing a window screen and jimmying the kitchen window open. When the police went to question him, they discovered the house was empty. Frank, Barb, and the kids were gone, having left everything they owned behind. The police kept a squad car in front of my house that night so I would feel safer. This happened several years ago. I still live in the same house, and Boots has gotten old and fat. The police haven't been able to find any trace of Frank or his family, nor did any investigation uncover any reason that he'd break into my house so late at night. As disgusted as I am, I hope his kids have been able to escape. My name is Sarah, and I'm here to share a chilling story that happened to my boyfriend Jake and I on his birthday. Jake decided he wanted to go on a ghost walk through an old, derelict prison, and let me tell you, it was an experience we'll never forget. It was a moonless night when we arrived at the prison. We joined a group of thrill seekers led by a bunch of experienced ghost hunters and mediums. Everyone was wearing dark clothes and carrying all sorts of ghost hunting gadgets, which honestly gave me the creeps right from the start, although I wasn't really a believer in the paranormal. The prison itself was a grim, towering structure. The iron gates creaked open as we walked through, the sound echoing in the eerie silence of the night. After exploring various sections of the prison, our guide, a medium named Emily, approached Jake and I. She looked at me with an intense gaze that made me kind of nervously laugh. She said, "You, young lady, have a spirit that has taken a liking to you. It's been following you for a while now." I exchanged a nervous glance with Jake. I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine. Jake squeezed my hand reassuringly, but his eyes showed unease. Emily asked if I'd be willing to participate in a test to ask the spirit to reveal itself to the group. I was hesitant, but curiosity got the better of me. I nodded, and Emily led us to a dimly lit corridor deep inside the prison. The walls seemed to close in on us as we walked, and the air grew heavy with a sense of foreboding. Emily explained that the test would involve using a technique called table tipping. It's a method where we place our hands on a small table and ask the spirit to communicate with us by tilting the table. I reluctantly agreed, and we gathered around a small wooden table that looked like it had seen better days. The medium, Emily, placed her hands on the table alongside Jake and me. We dimmed the lights further, leaving just a single flickering candle as our only source of illumination. Emily began speaking in a low, haunting tone, calling out to the spirit that supposedly followed me. The rest of the group all stood in front of me in the shadows, in pure silence, waiting. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. The silence was broken only by Emily's soft chants. I began to doubt the whole thing, thinking it was just a way to spook us. But then, the room grew colder, and I could feel an odd, tingling sensation in my fingertips. The table beneath our hands started to tremble ever so slightly. My heart raced as the table slowly began to tip. It was subtle at first, but then it gained momentum, tilting more and more. Jake and I exchanged terrified glances as the table seemed to respond to Emily's questions. It answered with a series of tilts, leaning toward yes or no in response to her questions. Emily asked the spirit to identify itself, and the table spelled out SARAH, which was my name. I hadn't told this to anyone there that night. My hands trembled on the table as I tried to make sense of what was happening. It felt surreal, like something out of a horror movie. But the worst was yet to come. Emily continued to communicate with the spirit, and it became increasingly agitated. The table tipped violently, and then the candle flickered and extinguished itself. The room plunged into darkness, and I felt an icy grip on my shoulder. I screamed, and Jake and I pulled our hands away from the table. Emily hurriedly lit another candle, revealing a chilling sight. There, in the dim light, we saw a handprint, dark and ghostly, imprinted on my shoulder. My heart pounded as the reality of the situation sank in. Had we awakened something that was now trying to make its presence known? Emily hastily closed the session, but the atmosphere changed. As we left the prison, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever spirit had attached itself to me was still there, lurking in the shadows. Jake and I couldn't sleep that night, haunted by the memory of that ghostly encounter. There are still parts of me that wonders if this was a setup somehow, but there was definitely no one behind us in that room. That's the story of how a birthday ghost walk turned into a night of terror. I hope you find it as spine-chilling as we did. And remember, sometimes it's better to leave the ghosts of the past undisturbed.
I love shopping, and there was no store I loved shopping at more than Target. It was a way for me to de-stress after a bad day at work. Shopping for things you didn't need is oddly very therapeutic. One night after work, I went to Target to look around and browse the fall and Halloween decor, since I was excited to get some new things for my house. And while I was looking at the costumes, I felt as if someone was watching me. When I looked up, I noticed a guy staring across the aisle at me with a horrific bunny mask on his face. I remember jumping with fear at first, since I was not expecting to see someone wearing a mask, but then laughing at how silly he looked. I mean, he was this giant of a man with a ton of muscles and wearing a bunny mask. I remember giving the guy a thumbs up. He stared at me for a moment before he gave me one back. I then went back to looking at potential costumes I could wear to my friend's upcoming Halloween party. In the end, I decided to look at the costumes another day, when I had more time to look through them all and wasn't exhausted from a long day at work. I took the small basket of items I did want toward the restrooms, since I had to use it very badly. I went into a stall to do my business, when a voice called out only seconds after I closed my stall door. But it was a male voice. At first, I froze on the toilet until the person announced they were maintenance and wanted to know if anyone was in the women's restroom since they had to clean it. I called back that it was just me, since I was the only woman in the restroom at the time, and expected him to wait outside until I was done. He didn't. I saw footsteps walk past the couple of stalls that were empty until they stopped at the one I was using. At this point, I was uncomfortable and felt bad that I was probably delaying the guy from doing his job, so I called out that I was almost done. The man didn't move from the stalls, though. I hurried to finish up and then told the man I was coming out, and he moved back away from my stall, making me exhale in relief. That is, until I opened the stall door and saw the man on the other side of it. The man wasn't wearing the Target uniform of red and khaki, but worst, I knew the guy and that he didn't work for the company because it was the same guy I had just seen from the Halloween aisle, and he was still wearing the bunny mask. Before I could scream, the man grabbed me by my shirt and tried to drag me into the biggest stall despite me trying to fight back. And when I was able to scream, he just shook me hard until I stopped screaming and felt like I was going to pass out. I don't know what would have happened if a Target employee hadn't heard me screaming and come running into the restroom to see what was happening. The employee, who couldn't be much older than me, didn't hesitate to jump at us and pull me out of my attacker's arms. Then he delivered a punch that echoed around the restroom as the guy who was attacking me screamed in pain. Unfortunately, the guy who attacked me ran out of the restroom before security or the police could be called. The Target employee took me to his manager's office as we waited for the police, but the guy who attacked me had come in with a mask, so the police, although sympathetic, had no way of getting a description. The mask wasn't even something they sold, meaning he came into the store prepared to try to harm someone. And unluckily, that person happened to be me. I didn't buy the things in my cart and went straight home that night. And I haven't been to Target since. I can't even use a public restroom anymore. I still have nightmares of that man wearing that horrific mask and him dragging me into the bathroom stall. Only, in my nightmares, a man in red and khaki doesn't save me in the end.
It's just a fact that whenever you talk to random strangers in chat rooms, you're gonna get some freaks. Some guys who are only there to try to pick up girls. Some folks who are there just because they're bored and think that the best way to remedy that situation is to be a troll and just antagonize people online. Luckily, the first group are behind a computer screen and can't actually get close enough to be creeps in person. And the second group are essentially keyboard warriors who are tough when typing, but who wouldn't dare do or say the things they talk about online if it came to it in real life. In general, that's true of everything in chat rooms. In a way, it's an alternate reality, a place where people behave in ways and say things they wouldn't if they were not anonymous and comfortably removed from actual reality. The online world generally just stays online and doesn't spill over into reality. Though of course, there are times when it's not that simple. While I can honestly say I've never been online or into a chat room with the express intention of trolling anyone, I have sometimes fed the trolls and argued with them. Mostly because I'm bored, and because I tend to find that most trolls aren't that bright or quick-witted, so tearing them apart in words is a fairly simple thing to do, and can feel quite rewarding. Other times, you'll get people who'll start with an agenda or proposition. They'll make their first sentence something wildly inflammatory about religion, politics, or race, just for the sake of starting an argument. Others will start with something like truth or dare, which in itself is stupid because they have no way of knowing A, if you'll complete the dare, or B, if you're telling the truth. Often, these guys overlap with the male creeps group, and the dare consists of something really predictable and basic like send nudes. I sometimes play along with these propositions or games up to this point, then switch to another user. They're mostly predictable and mostly harmless. But then, there was Samael. His first sentence when we were paired together was a question, and quite a provocative one. "Who do you want me to kill?" I smiled at this at first. It was original at least, and so I thought I'd play along and wind the guy up for a while. I asked if he was serious, and he said he was. Then, he posted a paragraph. Usually when you're talking to someone in a chat room, you can feel the speed they type. When an entire paragraph appears suddenly, after only a second, you can tell it was prepared beforehand and just copy-pasted in. This was a good example. "We all have people we hate. People who have crossed us, done us wrong, hurt or abused us in some way. Sometimes the slight is minor and can be tolerated. Sometimes you wish, really wish, that you could just kill them outright, and if there were no consequences, you probably would. How many times have you imagined beating your boss to death with your bare hands or choking the life out of him? How many times have you fantasized about killing that high school bully or the woman who stole your husband from you? You don't, because there are consequences. Now, there aren't. Tell me who they are. Tell me where to find them, and I'll kill them. No strings attached. No public figures, nobody famous, must be personally attached to you and to have personally wronged you. Other than that, no limits." I read over the message and again smiled. It was an interesting conversation starter, if a little weird and creepy. I asked Samael why he would offer to do such a thing, especially considering the risks to him of getting caught. "For fun," he replied, before adding, "Because it's justice. Some people deserve for something bad to happen to them, for an unseen blade to come out of the dark when they least expect it. A punishment they didn't expect, but definitely deserve. So who?" As the conversation went on, I continued to avoid mentioning anyone, but did start to become a little worried. "I have no link to you," he wrote, "other than this conversation, which will be deleted when we disconnect. We'll never meet. You'll never know who I am. The life could be taken any time. Tomorrow, next week, 5 years from now. Tell me a name and a place, and they go on the list. Tell me a name and a place, and I'll do the rest." I cut off the chat. I never heard from this Samael character again, though looking up his name did reveal that it's the name for the Angel of Death, which is clearly where he got it from. Despite never speaking to him again, I couldn't help wondering how many people he had spoken to already, and how many since. How many frustrated, bullied, or angry people had taken him up on his offer, either as a joke or in all seriousness. How many had given him a name and a place, and how many had he followed through with? The first time I experienced the phenomena people refer to as a sleep paralysis demon, I was at home in bed. I remember as clear as day that I thought I had woken up. The room was still dark, obviously, but I knew where I was, knew what was happening, and was about to shift onto my side to readjust positions and go back to sleep, when I suddenly realized that I couldn't. I tried again, and felt as I did a wave of blind panic creeping over me. I couldn't shift my body, or change my position, or even cry out for help. I was frozen in place, unable to move a muscle. I tried with every ounce of my being to prevent myself from panicking, to tell myself that this must be a dream, that people don't just wake up paralyzed. There has to be some cause. But even then, there was another part of me, a tiny, gnawing worm of doubt that was chewing through my attempts to be calm. Probing and questioning, asking whether maybe I had seen a documentary once, or heard on the news about brain dysfunctions or tropical diseases that could do this to a person. Things that could go wrong and mean that the victim remained completely conscious and aware, but trapped, unable to communicate inside their own bodies. If you were dreaming, the voice said, would you really be thinking things through like this? Would you be asking whether you're awake or not? I tried looking left and right and was slightly relieved to find that my eyes moved, but I was still in a blaze of panic at the idea that nothing else was working. I tried over and over to scream and call out, attempting to force the sound up and out of my lungs, when just to my right, I saw something move. A shape, indistinct but dark like a shadow, seemed to glide slowly across the scene just on the edge of vision. At first, I thought it might be smoke or some kind of steam, but as I stared ahead, I saw all at once that the dark outline had taken on a different shape. It was a person. Or if not a person, at least the outline and shape of a man, but made like a silhouette, entirely made from darkness. There was no color, no glimmer of highlight coming off this shape, and yet I could see it as it moved its heavy, rigid solidity. It was not a shadow, but a thing with weight and form. I tried again to scream, and as I did, the shape suddenly descended, sinking lower and almost out of view, until I felt a hideous weight across my thighs and hips, a thin single point of pressure on my stomach, and another on my chest. The points of weight I realized were hands, the larger weight the body, as this person, this thing, was climbing on top of me, holding me down and slinking like a giant lizard slowly up my body, closer and closer to my face. Again and again I tried to move, to flail and thrash, to swing at the thing, knock it to the ground and run for my life. But of course, I couldn't. Instead, I lay perfectly still, paralyzed and staring as this thing's face, a sheet of deepest black, came closer. 2 staring eyes, like diamonds, appeared inches from my face. Somewhere below those eyes, I knew there was a mouth. There must have been, because a voice, like some dark syrup, slithered out and into my ears, telling me over and over,
You can't move when you're like this. You can't move because you're mine. My little plaything, to do with as I please.
Moments later, I awoke, sitting bolt upright in bed, still feeling the heavy weight of the thing perched and resting on my chest. I flung back the sheets, swung my legs out of the bed, and with my back to the wall, looked around the room, surveying every corner and every space, looking for an intruder, for the thing that had slithered into my room and climbed atop my prone, defenseless body. The experience was terrifying. It was one that, given a choice, I would never have repeated again. That same day, I researched the incident, looking to see if others had ever experienced the same thing. I found that the vision, almost always the same, is quite common.
that many people around the world have seen or regularly see a sleep paralysis demon, a hallucination caused by the mind waking up slightly before the body. The body, still in sleep mode, remains paralyzed, while the mind, unable to react, hallucinates. It was a convincing explanation, but no more reassuring. I could at first have gotten some comfort from the fact that others had experienced the exact same thing as me, that I wasn't alone in my experience. But that was only at first. Since then, I've experienced variants of this phenomena that are unlike any that I've read about with others, and which had dire consequences for me. I said at the outset that the first time I experienced the sleep paralysis demon, I was at home in my bed. This has not always been the case. 2 years ago, I experienced paralysis and the demon during the early evening. I was not at home in bed. I was driving. I had been driving huge articulated vehicles for long-haul transport for almost 10 years at that point, and had never once fallen asleep at the wheel of a truck. Part of me finds it hard to believe that I fell asleep this time. You see, there was no gap, no passage of time or distance between waking and being paralyzed, even for a few seconds. Surely if I fell asleep, then I should have traveled some. A portion of time should have elapsed. But no. 1 minute I was driving down the highway. The next, I simply couldn't move, and sitting on my lap, its finger pressed to my lips, was that awful thing. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't make a sound. Not that I really needed to. The screeching tires, the crunch of metal and wailing high-pitched screaming meant there was more than enough sound already. Thankfully, no one died that day, but I got a jail sentence for reckless driving.
This happened to my family a few years back when we moved into our new house. It's a story that still gives me the creeps when I think about it. We were pretty excited about our new house. It was a charming 2-story home with a lovely front porch and a backyard perfect for our kids to play in. But little did we know, the house came with something else, something we couldn't have possibly imagined. At first, things seemed normal enough. We unpacked our belongings, settled in, and started adjusting to our new surroundings. My wife, well, she's always been a bit more sensitive to strange vibes, you know. She started mentioning that she felt like someone was watching her, especially at night. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the usual jitters of moving to a new place. As the days and weeks passed, things began to take a darker turn. My wife would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced she had heard whispers coming from the walls. I told her it was just the wind, or the old house settling, but deep down, I could tell she was genuinely scared. But then, she claimed to see shadows in the house when no one else was around. At first, I thought it was just our kids, or even her imagination. I didn't really believe it to be anything. I have to admit that there were times when I felt like I was being watched, or like I saw something move out of the corner of my eye, but I didn't really think anything more of it at the time. One chilly night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing in the hallway. I grabbed my baseball bat and tiptoed out of the room, convinced it was an intruder. But when I reached the hallway, there was no one there. I went to check on the kids in case it was them sneaking around, but they were both fast asleep in bed. One evening, my wife had gone out for groceries, taking the kids with her, leaving me home alone. I decided to catch up on some paperwork in the living room. The house was quiet, and I was enjoying the solitude. But as I sat there, the silence was suddenly shattered by the most blood-curdling scream I had ever heard. My heart raced, and I shot up from my chair, dropping my papers in the process. It sounded like the scream had come from the basement. My mind was racing as I sprinted down the stairs, calling out my children's names. My hands were trembling, and my voice quivered with fear. I burst into the dimly lit basement, heart pounding in my chest, ready to face whatever nightmare awaited me. But to my horror, there was no one there. That's when I realized that my wife had taken my kids, and I was home alone. I'm still skeptical, but I felt something was seriously wrong with this house. My hands still shaking, and climbed back up the stairs, feeling like I was being watched the entire time. When my wife returned, I told her what had happened, my voice shaky and filled with fear. We spoke to the neighbors who said there were some rumors that a family was murdered there years ago, but there wasn't any evidence of this. It was never mentioned during the sale, and we couldn't find anything online about it. I tried my best to convince myself that I must have dreamt it, or something, but truth be told, I couldn't ignore the mounting evidence any longer. My wife wasn't crazy, and we had to keep our family safe. We decided it was time to get out of that house before something even more terrifying happened. So we packed up our things once again, and even though we didn't experience anything truly malevolent, the fear had taken its toll. My wife no longer felt safe in her own home, and that was reason enough for us to leave. She describes it like something was trying to take over her, become a part of her. In the end, we managed to sell the house and move away from that place. But the memories of those strange occurrences still haunt us to this day. We found a new home, and we've managed to put that chapter of our lives behind us. But sometimes when I'm alone, I still feel like someone's watching me, like... There's no doubt about it, picking up hitchhikers can be dangerous. But if it was up to me, I would always be the one driving the car, rather than the one at the side of the road with my thumb out. Picking up hitchhikers is dangerous. Being picked up is far, far worse. A lot of the time when people submit horror stories about hitchhiking, the tales they tell sound like those old campfire stories. Urban myths we've all heard before, about a guy with a hooked hand or an axe murderer dressed up as a little old lady. In almost every case, it's the hitchhiker who's the bad guy, which when you think about it, doesn't really make sense. Obviously, there's a danger to any driver who picks up a stranger on some lonely road in the middle of the night, but the same is true in reverse. As someone who did a lot of hitchhiking in my youth, I can tell you from experience that in reality, it's the drivers who are more likely to be the monsters. From the weird old perverts who think that they're owed if they give you a lift, to the truly psychotic nutjobs who see hitchhikers as potential prey, the drivers can be just as bad as any campfire boogeyman who chooses to hitch a ride. Trust me, I know. What's kinda worse about being the hitchhiker in this scenario is the fact that you can never tell. You're literally volunteering to get into the car with these people based upon a few seconds' glance. How could you ever tell from one brief image whether the guy is a decent man who will take you where you want to go, or the kind of guy who keeps a hammer and a length of rope in his glove compartment? The answer is you can't. You can tell yourself that you have good instincts, that you're a good judge of character, but once you're in the car and speeding along, you're vulnerable, basically trapped in there with this person until they choose to let you out, never quite knowing who's a nice guy and who really, really isn't. My worst ever experience hitchhiking did not involve a hooked hand or an axe murderer. In fact, it involved no gore or violence at all, as far as I know, but it was undeniably awful. I had been standing by the side of the road for around 2 hours when he pulled up. I was hoping to get to the city around 40 miles away, and the guy driving agreed to take me. I remember he was driving a blue sedan car and he wore glasses. He had a friendly smile and had both a St. Christopher medallion and a crucifix hanging from his wing mirror. Looking into the neatly kept car, I decided that this looked like a fairly safe option. If it hadn't been for his lack of facial hair, I'd have said that this guy looked like a real-life Ned Flanders, and to some extent he sounded like one too. This much I remember. He was a talkative kind of guy, and had me sit up front with him so he could chat along as we drove. In the course of the conversation, he asked me about my family. Now, without going into any details, I'll just say that this was a touchy subject at the time, and partly the reason I was hitchhiking in the first place. When he asked if I lived with my mom and dad, I said I couldn't remember. That one phrase changed things. The guy began to look disturbed and twitchy as he asked me what I meant by I couldn't remember. He then got into this whole philosophical debate, mostly with himself, about how memory was of the utmost importance. His words became snappy, and he spoke in short, aggressive bursts that also involved him raising his voice, as if chastising me. He talked about how it's your memories that make your personality, how it's memories that define and build you, and how memories should be cherished. I kept my mouth shut. Clearly, he wasn't happy with what I'd said. For a moment, I thought that maybe I'd touched a nerve. Maybe he had a relative with Alzheimer's or dementia. So to him, the idea that someone would be so flippant about remembering things was a touchy subject. Maybe he was an alcoholic or drug addict in his past and had big gaps in his own memories.
Either way, the atmosphere in the car had undoubtedly changed and become awfully uncomfortable. Eventually, he came to a silence. Then, smiling as if in an attempt to break the tension, he reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a family pack of candy bars. He took one, and laughing to himself told me that this was his secret stash. His wife didn't like him eating too much chocolate, so he kept them in here as a little treat for himself. He grinned, made me promise not to tell, and bit down on one as he smirked. He then offered me one of the others, and in an attempt to lighten the mood, I accepted. That was a mistake. When I woke up, I was back at exactly the point where the guy picked me up. I was laying on my back as if sleeping. I remember sitting bolt upright and shouting, as if waking from a nightmare in a fit of panic and desperately trying to work out where I was. Eventually, I worked out where I was, but had no idea how I'd gotten there. Had he just driven me around in a circle and dumped me at the side of the road? Panicked, I checked my pockets and bag to make sure I had all my possessions and important things like documents and wallet. I also checked myself to make sure that I hadn't been injured, bruised, or interfered with in any way. As far as I could tell, I was fine, exactly as I had been just before he picked me up. I knew even then that there must have been something in the candy bar, and that after eating it, I had clearly passed out. I had lost time and had a huge gap in my memory, during which literally anything could have happened. It was only around 4 hours later, after another hitched ride, when I arrived in the city, that I realized just how serious this was, because when I looked at the cover of a newspaper, I saw that it was no longer the same day. In fact, it was a full week later. An entire week of my life was missing. I wasn't hurt. I hadn't been violated or robbed, and as far as I could tell, nothing untoward had happened to me. But an entire week of my life was missing. From the moment I ate that chocolate bar to the moment I woke up, there was just a blank space of 7 days. What happened between those points, where I was taken, how I was fed, cleaned, and went to the toilet, I don't know. My friends have told me to visit a doctor, to get an x-ray to make sure nothing was put into me or even taken out. But if it had, there would be scars or wounds, right? They also said I should look myself up on the internet to make sure there aren't photos of me naked all over some weirdo sites. I haven't looked. What exactly happened to me and why the guy drugged me, I will never know. And of course, now, I can't remember. It's pretty tough to be a motel owner. When someone doesn't turn in, I usually have to cover myself, and this was one of those nights. I'm sure that compared to the average motel, we get more weird and creepy people passing through. That's not to say that our place off the highway is particularly shoddy or anything. It tends to be the clientele that bring the drama. The drama began to peak around November of last year, and there's one incident that still chills me to my core to think about. I remember the night clearly. A man out of character for the setting had wandered in, adorned in a neatly ironed business top tucked into his pants that wrapped around the ankles of his shiny shoes. He was ghostly pale too, a rarity among the demographic of the clientele I usually saw around. He was coupled with a dark-skinned woman that wrapped her arm around his waist like a big belt. She slurred a few words to me as she came up to the counter, clearly on something, but most likely just drunk. Whatever she said sounded like, "Towel, please." I affirmed to her that although our motel provided a face towel and a kit of conditioner and shampoo, there were no towels offered. She made an animalistic noise in protest. The man paid for his room soon after that, and they disappeared into the night. Come 8 o'clock, and the weird occurrences had already begun to trickle in. Neighbors had begun to complain about strange noises coming from room 12B, the one that I had leased to the couple just earlier, and that the sounds were showing no sign of stopping. I rang the direct line to the room, and unfortunately, no one picked up. That meant I had to abandon my Minesweeper game, put on my shoes, and exert some actual physical activity for once, and I hated it. I was almost dragging my feet over to 12B. I felt like a teenager waking up for school. And that's when it caught me in my tracks. A blood-curdling scream from the woman that could have shattered a few eardrums if listened to up close. When I heard that, I knew something terrible was going on. I had two options: to launch my phone to dial the police, or keep pushing closer to their motel room and stop the man in his tracks. I chose the latter. I sprinted up the front stairs of the motel and charged to the door of 12B. I heard a distant scream, so I shouted I was coming in and used my master key to override the lock. Nothingness. There was no one there. No sign of the man or the woman. The window was slightly ajar, and so I decided to call the cops. As I looked around the room, I noticed a few blood droplets on the pillows and bedding. Nothing overly concerning, but blood nonetheless. I also noticed the bathroom mirror had been broken. I never did find out what happened, and I often wonder if the woman's okay. In the weeks and months leading up to that strange incident, there had been multiple women reported missing from the area. It was assumed they had been abducted by a man. I can't stop myself thinking about if that was the suspect right in front of me, leading a night worker into my motel to commit the unthinkable. Even worse, it occurred to me, what if the woman wasn't asking for a towel, but was asking for help, and I was her last ray of hope?
Several years ago, I used to rent out a spare room in my home, which I would advertise through Craigslist. I was a single female and used to get a lot of attention from guys in my younger days. I used to have both guys and gals showing an interest in the room and property. Most guys would make inappropriate comments about living together and ended up together amongst other seedy comments. I would generally just laugh it off, and on most occasions wouldn't hear from them again to secure the room. I didn't live in the most central of places, so most potential lodgers would have to travel for work or recreational purposes. I had this one guy called Martin come to check the room, and as he was looking around, he made a series of inappropriate comments like, maybe we'll end up together, and we could share a room and keep this one as a spare. He even asked to see my room, which I told him was off limits. This guy was a total creep, and really made me feel uncomfortable. I really didn't like the guy. He was scruffy, with a tear in his jacket. He smelled like he smoked 40 a day, never brushed his teeth, and clearly hadn't washed in weeks. Maybe he was homeless or going through a bad patch. However, manners and decency don't cost a thing. I told him the room was $800 per month, plus bills, to try and deter him from wanting the room. He looked at me and paused for a minute with this longing glare. In my nervousness, I realized that I'd included the price on the Craigslist ad. Usually I would put price negotiable, but I had listed it for $400 as I was getting pretty desperate for the money. At this point, I just wanted the guy gone, as he was making me feel really uncomfortable, and I was starting to feel unsafe in my own home. I told him I forgot I listed it for $400 and said if he was interested he would need to fill some forms out for vetting and credit checks and that this was standard procedure. "Sure, no problem," he said. He filled out an application form and paid the vetting fees in cash. I didn't know what to do. I really didn't want this guy in my house, and I felt too vulnerable to tell him while we were alone. I didn't want to take the money, but I thought to myself, if I just got him out of the house, I'll deal with whatever happens later and return his money to him. He eventually left and looked me up and down as we walked out of the door. I can't wait for us to live together. This guy seriously gave me the creeps. I was so relieved when he left. I locked my door and just got on with my day the best I could. That night as I was going to bed, I heard a kind of scratching sound coming from outside. I wasn't sure if this was something being dragged along the floor or along the side of my house. I made sure all the curtains were closed and turned off the lights. The scratching lasted for about 10 minutes, and I remember thinking it was maybe just a wild deer or something. A couple of days later, and quite late into the evening, Martin called me asking if I had an update on his application. I told him it was unsuccessful, and without giving me an opportunity to explain, Martin started shouting at me, calling me a liar. I was lost for words and stuttered that I wasn't lying and had no reason to lie. I offered the money back for his application. There was a moment's silence while I could hear Martin breathing heavily down the phone. "I'm coming to collect." He then hung up the phone. I was scared, like more scared than I've ever been in my life. I locked all the doors, pulled all the curtains, and turned off the lights. I thought about calling the police, but there wasn't any evidence that he was a threat, other than me not liking his vibe. I wasn't even sure when he was coming right then and there. I sat in the dark with my cover wrapped around me to hide the light casting from my phone, and that's when I heard it. The same scratching sound I heard a couple of nights earlier. It was moving from one side of the house to the other. I couldn't tell if it was inside the house or outside. Then there was silence.
Bang, bang, bang. Open up. I know you're in there.
He was at my bedroom window. I just stayed where I was, motionless with fright. He continued to move around my house, scratching whatever it was he was dragging around with him. Eventually, I heard the scratching sound start to move away from the house and make its way into the distance. I gave it 10 minutes before deciding to look out my window. I jumped back with fright as Martin had his face pressed up against my bedroom window. I asked him to leave and told him I would wire him the money. He grinned at me before walking away. I never saw or heard from Martin again, but for about 6 months after this happened, I would occasionally hear the same scratching sound making its way around my house.
When I was young, I lived next to Mr. Coates. He was an odd little man that seemed to know more cats than he did people. He was short, old, and a bit frail. But most curious of all, he never seemed to close his curtains at night. So, every now and again, my siblings and I played our usual game, where we would watch Mr. Coates and his cats through his windows. We never really spoke to him, of course, so we didn't know the names of his pets, but we came up with our own. Our favorite cats of his were Minky, the black and white spotted cat with a snub tail, and Tyson, the small-framed ginger cat.
I've seen him outside our house, standing dead still like a scarecrow,
my brother said to me. I argued that he was lying. My sister agreed with me, saying that he never leaves the house.
Why do you think he leaves his curtains open?
Tom asked.
Maybe he's claustrophobic,
my sister replied. A few days came and went. Nothing out of the ordinary came out from next door, except for one of his many cats that wouldn't stop screaming. It was so loud it managed to penetrate through to our house, which is rather hard considering his house is sealed. He never cracks a window, never lets the cats out, only leaves the curtains wide open and nothing else. Mr. Coates had a break-in by a couple of teenagers who smashed his kitchen window and tried to raid his home. Our family saw the whole thing unfold, but for some reason or another, the kids didn't take anything. Apparently, they were too terrified to rob the guy. At least that's what my sister tells us. On Tuesday night, I was home alone. My parents decided to take a trip to Grandpa's house for the evening. My siblings, Tom and Sam, went with them, while I stayed at home with a sniffling nose and a cough, which felt like I had swallowed broken glass. I didn't mind being sick when I was a kid, as long as it was during the weekdays, when I knew I could pull a sickie and stay at home and play PlayStation. Mr. Coates' curtains were wide open for the street to see, as they always were. However, on this night, the lights were oddly off. I wasn't sure if he had simply gone to bed early or if he was out, though I have never once seen him leave his property. I watched over his house for a little while, but there was never any sign of the black and white cat, Minky. Calling it quits for the night, I stood up and walked to my bedroom window to shut my curtains. And that's when my heart sank. For the first time in years, Mr. Coates had left his property. He stood unblinking at the end of our driveway, his pale and sickly complexion looking ghoulish under the moonlight. I went to shut the curtain, but I noticed his silhouette waver. I put my arm back, and he stopped. Each and every time I reached for the curtain, he crept into a walking position, as if once I closed the curtain, he would launch towards the house. Feeling one long chill travel down my spine, I made my way to the kitchen to call my mom. The phone rang for a while, but eventually beeped to voicemail. Defeated, and with my heart still racing, I peered into the lounge. Mr. Coates was there, standing at the window.
Where is she?
He rasped.
Where's my cat?
I began to mouth the words, I don't know, and as I did, he began to tap his head on the glass. Harder, then harder still, until it was about to break. I begged him to stop headbutting the window, but before long, he came through in a clattering hail of glass. My screams echoed through the empty home as I ran up the staircase into my room. I sprinted into my room, ripping my phone from the wall charger on the way in. Rolling into a ball, I managed to squeeze myself in my bedroom closet. From there, I could hear his slow, deliberate footsteps creaking the wood as he climbed the stairs. And before long, he was at the top of the staircase, staring into my dimly lit bedroom from the hall. I was staring through the wooden bars of the closet, and although he was locking eyes with me, I knew he couldn't see me. At least, that's what I was hoping for. For a moment, I unlocked my phone, but when I noticed that the screen lit up my face, I immediately locked it. Once he had pushed a little past the hall into Sam's bedroom, I began to call the police. During the call, I could hear him scraping our wallpaper off with his long fingernails as he searched for his cat. Or me, I couldn't know for certain. Seconds passed after that conversation with the cops. Minutes felt like hours, but when they did finally arrive, I felt a safe warmth rush over me. They managed to subdue him and lead him away from the property. I'm not sure of the whole story exactly, but from what I could gather, Mr. Coates has late-stage dementia. His cat, Minky, had gone without food for days when they found her barely breathing in one of the walls in his house. I guess the whole ordeal was rather terrifying, but I came away from that experience thinking maybe if I checked up on Mr. Coates a bit more, instead of just spying on him, things would have turned out different. I was obsessed with the weird things he was doing rather than why, but for now, I'm glad he's finally getting the care he needs.
My school goes all out for homecoming week. Each day we get to dress up in different themes and play games during lunch. It's pretty fun. I'm the student body president, so I get to organize most of the activities. It was Tuesday, and the theme was called Skittles Day. Basically, each class was assigned a different color to wear, and we do competitions like relay races and water balloon fights. Honestly, it was really fun. I'm a senior, which meant I was wearing orange like the rest of my grade. We had just lost our relay race with the sophomores, so everyone was a little disappointed. The bell rang and we had to go back to class. I was still outside cleaning up when the principal made an announcement that there was an immediate lockdown. We'd have to stay in our classrooms until further notice. He didn't give us a reason, but his voice sounded a little panicked. I started to get scared because I was still in the courtyard and no one else was around. I ran to the door, but it had already been locked. I was trapped outside and I had no idea what was going on. I didn't want to knock on the door because I didn't want to draw attention to myself if there was some kind of threat inside. I figured the best thing I could do was hide behind the lunchroom and wait until the principal announced that everything was okay. My phone was back in my locker, so I couldn't call anyone for help. I was crouched down behind the dumpsters, praying that I was safe. I waited for a long time, but there was no further announcement. After about 10 minutes, I got up to see if there was anyone else in the courtyard. At first, I didn't see anyone. Then, I noticed a police officer patrolling around the edge of the building. I stayed where I was, but I waved at him when he glanced in my direction. He marched over right away and asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine and asked him what was going on. He explained that there had been a bomb threat, so all the students had to stay inside while he and the other officers checked the school grounds. I thought that was a little strange. We'd had bomb threats before, and even though they were false alarms, we always had to evacuate the building. It didn't make sense that the students would have to stay inside the building if there was the possibility of a bomb. He must have noticed my confusion, because he said that the potential bomb was somewhere in the courtyard, so the safest place for everyone was back inside. I started to panic. We were in the courtyard. He told me not to worry. All I had to do was follow him back to his police car and wait there until the whole area was checked. He grabbed my arm and started guiding me back toward the parking lot. I was still nervous, but I felt a lot safer with the policeman. As we walked, he told me how lucky I was that he found me. Just as we stepped out into the parking lot, the speaker came back on for another announcement. I could hear the principal's voice. "Attention students, please remain in your classrooms. There's a dangerous man on the premises posing as a police officer. If you see him through a window, please tell your teacher right away." I froze, realizing that this man wasn't really a policeman. He looked at me and tightened his grip on my arm.
"Don't say a word."
I wanted to scream for help, but I saw the gun on his hip. I knew he'd hurt me if I struggled at all, so I kept walking with him. He was leading me toward a beat-up Nissan, obviously not a cop car. He pushed me toward it and ordered me to get inside. I was too scared to move.
"Get inside!"
he screamed. My hands shaking, I reached for the door. He smiled and waited as I opened it. Then, a loud voice shouted at us from a distance.
"Get away from her!"
I looked up and saw that the real police had arrived. There were at least 8 of them, all pointing their guns at the man. I dove to the ground and waited for gunshots. I didn't hear anything. When I looked up, the police had already swarmed around the imposter and wrestled him to the ground. I stayed on the pavement as they shoved him into a real police car and drove away. 2 of the real officers came up to me and checked for injuries. Aside from a bruise on my arm, I was okay. They asked if I wanted them to drive me back home, but I refused. I knew they were there to help, but I still didn't feel safe. I said I'd rather go back inside and be with my classmates. They understood and let me go, apologizing for what I'd just been through. When I got inside, the entire senior class was waiting for me. It was like a sea of orange. They ran toward me and wrapped me in the biggest group hug. I was sobbing, but I finally felt safe. I've been a trucker for the better part of my life, and I've seen some strange things on these long-haul journeys. But there's one night that still gives me the shivers. It was a cold, dark Thursday night, with rain pounding the windshield and wind howling like a banshee. I was in the middle of nowhere, right in the heartland of the United States. My truck rumbled along, the wipers slapping back and forth to fend off the relentless rain. It was so dark I could barely see a few feet ahead of me, and the road was slick as snot. The radio played these old classics, but even the familiar old tunes couldn't shake the eerie feeling that hung in the air. I was alone on that desolate highway, not a soul in sight. Then, the CB radio came to life, a crackling voice breaking through the static.
Mayday! Mayday! This is Truck 14! I need help! I'm in some deep trouble out here, over!
My grip tightened on the wheel as I listened to the desperation in the voice on the other end.
This is Truck 27, send your message!
The voice rattled, asking if I could help. He said that his truck had hit something in the road, and he felt like it was put there purposefully to bring him to a halt. He told me his location, and when I checked on my GPS, he was only approximately 15 minutes away. I put my foot down and headed toward the location, the rain still pelting my windshield like angry hornets. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the given coordinates. There, on the side of the road, was Truck 14, hazard lights flashing wildly. The door to the cab was open, but I couldn't see anyone else around. I jumped out of my truck, calling out for the trucker of Truck 14, but there was only silence and the howling wind. I approached the abandoned truck, the engine still running, and a steaming cup of coffee left in the cup holder. It was as if the driver had just up and vanished. Something was definitely off. I pulled out my cell phone, which thankfully now had enough reception to make a call, so I dialed 911 and explained the situation. They promised to send help, but in the darkness and the rain, I had this sinking feeling that something just wasn't quite right, and started to fear that I was the target for an ambush. As I walked back towards my truck, the darkness seemed to close in around me, and the only sounds were the raindrops splattering on the pavement and the soft creaking of my rig. And then, something caught my eye. Through the downpour, I saw the faint, fading taillights of another vehicle in the distance, driving away from Truck 14's location. But I couldn't make out much more than that. It was just a fleeting glimpse. Finally, the police arrived. They combed the area, but there was no trace of the missing trucker. The officer questioned me, and I told them everything. They assured me they'd keep searching, but in my gut, I knew this wasn't a regular missing person case. The truck was untouched. Stories from other truckers have since reached my ears, whispers at the truck stops about strange occurrences on that very stretch of road. They say that some truckers have disappeared without a trace, leaving only their abandoned rigs behind. I can't explain what happened that night. It's a memory that haunts me to this day.
I've heard tales of other truckers seeing mysterious figures on the road, unexplained phenomena, and strange lights. Some believe it's a place where the supernatural and the mundane intersect, where the road keeps its secrets hidden. Not me. I'm a little more level-headed than that. I believe it was a real kidnapping, but I'll never know for sure. One thing that doesn't make sense to me is the trailer was untouched. No signs of a break-in, and it appeared as if all the cargo was still there. So I know it wasn't your everyday robbery. And what happened to the trucker? Well, I guess we'll never know. So if you're a trucker, or even if you're not, be careful driving those long stretches of road in the middle of nowhere, as you never know what might be lurking in the darkness. So drive safe, and keep those doors locked and those lights on.
Recently, I visited the Dominican Republic for the first time. I checked into this really lavish Airbnb in the colonial district of Santo Domingo. I was supposed to go with my brother Paul, but he canceled at the last minute. I was disappointed, of course, because the whole trip had been his idea. He'd gone by himself the year before and said it was the best vacation of his life. He said he wanted to do it all over again with me. I'd even used his extra laptop to book the same Airbnb. Then, a week before we were supposed to go, he said he had some business he had to do. He'd saved up a lot recently and was working on launching a new company. It was too late to cancel our reservations, so I decided to just go without him. I checked into the place around sunset. The house's owner, Miguel, seemed really friendly. He greeted me with a big hug and acted like we were old friends. After I unpacked, I went outside to explore the boardwalk along the river. Miguel was waiting for me outside. He asked if I wanted to go with him to the best bar in the neighborhood. He seemed pretty trustworthy, so of course I said yes. The bar was on the roof of one of the taller buildings on our street. It had a great view of the ancient buildings around us, and we drank together and watched the fireworks. Miguel kept encouraging me to drink. After a while, I started to feel woozy. I didn't feel drunk, though. I felt sick and lightheaded. Something was wrong. I saw Miguel smiling at me across the table, but his face was getting blurry. That's when I realized that he'd slipped something into my drink. After that, everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in the Airbnb. The lights were off and all the windows were covered. I tried to move, but my hands and feet were tied to a chair.
What's going on?
I shouted. Miguel stood over me. Because the lights were out, I couldn't see his face, but I could see his silhouette, and I knew he had a gun in his hands. He laughed.
I can't believe you dared to come back here.
What?
I had no idea what he was talking about.
Where's the money?
He asked. I heard him cock the gun.
There's been a misunderstanding,
I said.
I don't know you. I've never been here before.
Shut up, Paul,
he said.
You know exactly what I'm talking about.
He called me Paul. That's when I realized that he thought I was my brother. I was a couple years younger than him, but we looked a lot alike. And when I checked in, I didn't introduce myself. I guess he just assumed I was Paul. I'd booked the room from his laptop, so it was under his name. I tried to explain that I didn't know who he was or what money he was talking about, but he didn't believe me. He said that I'd met him last year and tricked him out of $10,000. Now it all made sense. I never understood how Paul had saved up enough money to start his own business. Apparently, he'd stolen it. And once he realized that I'd booked the same Airbnb, of course he had to cancel the trip. Miguel aimed the gun right at my face.
Where's the money?
He demanded again. I started crying. I begged him to let me go. I told him to go to the table and look at my passport. He walked over and grabbed my passport. He turned on the lights and saw that I was telling the truth. Then he turned back toward me and said that it didn't matter who I was. He still wanted his money back. I didn't have that much in my bank account. I couldn't pay him back. I looked around the room, trying to see if there was something I could use to free myself. Then I realized that I had Paul's laptop with me. I told Miguel that if he untied my hands, I could get onto Paul's computer and wire him everything. He didn't trust me at first, but then he slowly reached forward and untied my hands. He put the laptop on my lap. I went to Paul's online bank account, silently praying that his passwords were saved on this computer. I tried to log in, but it asked me to verify my identity. My heart sank. I clicked on the security question and a screen popped up asking, "Who's your best friend?" I wasn't sure. Paul had so many friends to choose from, and I didn't know what answer he saved. Miguel jabbed the gun into my shoulder.
Faster!
He shouted. Without thinking, I typed in my own name, and it worked. Paul's checking account appeared on the screen. I clicked on the instant transfer button and had Miguel type in his bank number. When he was done, he turned the laptop back toward me and told me to hit send. I did. We waited for 5 long minutes before a notification bell chimed from his phone. He smiled, put his gun back in his pocket, and untied me. He left without saying anything. I grabbed my stuff and checked into a hotel on the other side of the city. It was very expensive, so I just used Paul's card information to book it. I'm still on the island, and I plan to enjoy the rest of my trip. I just have to stay away from Miguel's neighborhood. Paul has been calling me nonstop all morning, but I haven't answered. As soon as I get back home, he and I are going to have a nice, long chat. I still remember that day as if it were yesterday. It happened when I was a freshman in high school, and it started off like any other school day. I got there early, and I remember that I was dreading AP History. I always hated that course. The teacher ran it like it was a college course, and that day we had to outline 2 chapters before the end of the class and then take a pop quiz. It was our teacher's form of punishment for misbehaving for the substitute. Back then, I was what you'd call a rebel, and I had been thinking of ways to skip that class since that morning. I even attempted to play sick, but my dad didn't buy it for a single second. That was when I got the brilliant idea to skip the rest of the day. The class was my 4th period, and lunch was right before, so I could easily sneak out in the middle of the chaos of people emerging from the lunchroom. I was dead set to do this, and I had done it several times before, but I didn't realize what exactly I would be setting myself up for. I waited until it was right in the middle of the lunch block switches before I made my escape. I casually used 2 senior football players as a shield to get by unseen. I waited until I was a safe distance from the school before I took a quick right and headed towards the parking lot, hoping to take a shortcut into the main business district of my town. I couldn't just go home because I knew my dad was there. The goal was to just wait around for some time and then head back after the period ended. After finding a quiet spot, I sat and ate my own lunch before ultimately turning to head back to classes. It was back as I was about to enter a wooded area that I saw them. Cop cars, and lots of them, sirens screeching as they flew right by me and headed right towards my school. Then, my pocket started to vibrate. I didn't get it in time, but as soon as it stopped for 3 seconds, it started right back. Confused, I picked up my pace. Coming out into a spot that granted me access, I saw the cars lined up along the building and officers outside the doors. From where I was standing, they had the place locked down. I quietly went back into the wooded area and pulled out the phone. I saw that not only my dad had called, but I had numerous texts from him too. Still confused, I was hesitant to call him back. Stupid, I know. I knew that getting back inside the school was physically impossible by that point, but I still waited to see what would play out. I could hear their scanners beeping incredibly loud, but the words were garbled. Instead, I picked up my cell phone again and looked up news outlets to see if anyone was reporting, and lo and behold, someone was. I clicked the link, and what popped up was a video feed of the school and another home that was literally across the street and 2 doors down. Not even a stone's throw away, from what was being said, a domestic situation escalated, and the man had fired his gun. When cops confronted him, he fled into the woods near the school. I felt my pulse speed up and looked at the trees surrounding me. The portion of the woods that I was currently standing in felt empty, but it was woods, so there weren't necessarily clear views all around. The gravity of just how sticky of a situation I was in finally set in, and I had the sudden urge to throw up. I knew running out of the woods wasn't ideal, considering the armed men right out front, but also, there could be an armed man in there with me, so I felt trapped. I felt like I was about to hyperventilate. Then, as if on cue, I heard rustling of leaves coming from behind me. I panicked. I turned and pressed myself into the side of a tree and willed myself to be small, to be unseen. The next step was I hoped and prayed it worked. I stayed down and kept my ears trained to listen for the slightest of noises. I could hear someone in the distance, still, and they sounded like they had the same idea as me. Stay down. It wasn't a comforting realization. I kept in a crouching position as I nearly duck-waddled to another tree, looking for a better angle. Still nothing. It wasn't until I went to shift once again that I caught sight of what looked like black hair. Not willing to risk it, I did the stupidest thing possible and took off in the opposite direction, back towards town. I kept running and jumping over the roots of trees. I dropped my bag too, not even caring. If it was my bag or me, I knew my dad would understand. I kept hearing the snapping of branches. I could hear someone yelling, but the words were gibberish. It wasn't until I was almost at the home stretch that I felt hands grab me. I started screaming and kicking before I zoned back into what was happening around me. The black hair I saw was a helmet worn by an officer. He quickly snatched me back, and when I went to yell, he swiveled me just enough that I saw another man being held practically at gunpoint by what appeared to be a SWAT team. Instantly, the fight left me. I went limp in his grasp. Within seconds, I watched as a beanbag got shot in the distance, and several men rushed forward, immobilizing the man. When I understood enough to look back at the man holding me, he looked really upset. I cringed. Instead of allowing me the option to return to class, he opted to drive me home in a cop car. Sure, my dad was thrilled I was safe, but when he heard why I was safe, anger took the driver's seat again. As for a punishment, I'll let you use your imagination on that one.